from the Mutual Broadcasting System. This is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT. Welcome to Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. I've got a number of things. I don't have a guest today. I'm just going to cover a number of things that have been in the news, big global issues, all of which have tremendous strategic import on the United States, but also on countries around the globe. So let me go ahead and get started with these things. And I'm going to kick off by talking about something that, yes, it got attention, but it's not something that's completely understood by everybody. And that is what's happening with Pakistan and India. This goes back a long way. Now, I heard President Trump on Air Force One saying something about that border or the issues between Pakistan and India go back, or that border between them goes back 1,500 years or something like that. Well, I hate to say it, but that particular border, no, it does not go back 1,500 years. That particular border goes back to 1947. It really goes to the partition of Pakistan from India. Little history there. Pakistan, India, what was primarily Hindu ended up in India, and what was primarily Muslim ended up in Pakistan. And because of how smoothly that worked and how contiguous those areas were, for a long time you had East Pakistan and Pakistan, or West Pakistan, and the East Pakistan was what we now call Bangladesh. And in the 70s, they had a very bloody civil war, if you want to call it, or war to separate themselves from Pakistan proper, and they became a separate country called Bangladesh. But obviously religion is a big part of this. Now, this all goes up to Kashmir, and Kashmir is in the Himalayan high ground, if you will, the Himalayan mountains. A beautiful area, parts of it. There's a part of it that is often called the Switzerland of the Himalayas. It's just an absolutely gorgeous area. And when there's not a lot of terrorism and warfare happening, tourists have historically loved to go up in that area and do all sorts of things, as tourists were doing last Tuesday. And they were enjoying this trip they had up there. They were in this nice little pastoral setting, and then they were attacked. And they were attacked by Islamic extremist gunmen who went in and just conducted an absolutely brutal assault. Some of the things that they did sounds like October 7th down in Israel, with basically, quizzing people, having them recite parts of the Quran, and if they couldn't do it, they would execute them on sight, separating husbands from their wives and children, and then executing the husbands in front of their wives and children. Just absolutely brutal, horrific, inhuman sort of behavior by these terrorists. Religion. Kashmir is a part of India. Kashmir, by population, certainly in 1947, was about 70% Muslim. Hence, the thinking was that in the partition, that the Kashmir region up in the Himalayas, which is on the border of both Pakistan and India, way up north, would end up in Pakistan. However, the Maharaja that controlled the Kashmir was Hindu, and he did not want to go over to Pakistan, and he kept Kashmir on the Indian side of that partition, and it has been a battle ever since, with multiple insurgent terrorist groups doing all kinds of horrible things, and the Pakistani government, and particularly its intelligence service, the ISI, having a very active hand in trying to support these various groups in their attacks against India, and particularly in their attacks in and around the Kashmir, aimed at the Indian government, Indian forces, Indian military, what have you, as part of a, you could say, hybrid warfare, low-grade insurgency, whatever you want to call it, but that's what India's been doing ever since. And occasionally there were some hot wars, actual fighting on the, between Indian forces and Pakistani forces over the years. So it's not all just been by proxy. Some of it's been head-to-head sort of stuff as well. All right, so that's what it's about. But what I want to point out is that Kashmir is this high ground in the Himalayas. And it's a high ground where the snow melt, the ice melt, the glacial melt forms these vast river systems. And there is a treaty that was put in place in 1960 called the Indus Water Treaty, and it separates out the waters, and the Kashmir is the headwater towards the Indus River system. And so of 6 rivers that are covered on this treaty, the Indus and 2 of its tributaries flow into Pakistan. The Indus River is the lifeblood of Pakistan. 80% of Pakistani agriculture is dependent on the Indus River system as a whole. So this is not an insignificant strategic issue for Pakistan. It's always been that way, and you can kind of almost move the religion off to the side, because really, if you look at it, they want access, they want to guarantee access, they want to guarantee the flow of that life-giving river system, that life-giving water going into Pakistan. They do not want that shut off. And to India's credit, since 1960, they have never, even when they're in hot wars on their own border, they have never said we're going to, abrogate the treaty or somehow stop the treaty from being fulfilled until now. After this terrorist attack, tensions went up very, very fast in India. The political pressure went up very fast in India. It wasn't quite clear who this group was, but the widespread belief, and this may have been based on Indian intelligence, was that this was something that was put together by the Pakistanis, that this wasn't some, homegrown sort of thing, that this was something that was cooked up in Pakistan and they went in there. And part of it by attacking tourists, particularly foreign tourists, but also attacking Hindu tourists. They were going after tourism. They were going after a vital revenue stream towards the Kashmir area and trying to cause terror that would deter tourists from going to that area and leave that area free from outside influence, give them a freer hand in whatever they're doing in terms of an insurgency. That would be the thinking on that. So let's just say the temperature gauge politically went up very fast, and one of the first things the Indians did was they said, that's it, we're going to shut down the water going under the Indus Water Treaty into Pakistan. That is huge. All right. Now, Pakistan and India are both nuclear powers. They both have over 170 nuclear warheads, nuclear weapons between them. They have a variety of different ways. India has a little bit more robust way of delivering some of these missiles or some of these weapons, but Pakistan has a variety of means, missiles and planes by which they can deliver them. The Indians add on to that they have a variety of things with the naval capability as well added on to that. But regardless, let's just say that they could cause a phenomenal amount of damage. Now, these warheads generally are not as big as some of the things we'd be accustomed with the United States. Instead of the U.S. and Russia, shall we say, the warheads are not in the megaton range. They're not in the 300 kiloton range. They're more or less a little bit smaller. 40 kilotons is a very common warhead size between the two powers. So they're not quite as big. But 40 kilotons is pretty darn big. That's bigger than certainly what you saw at Nagasaki or Hiroshima. So they can cause a phenomenal amount of damage. And the ways that they can deliver them, through a variety of missiles, to include cruise missiles, let's just say that they could definitely cause a lot of problems there. India, I should say, has a border dispute with China, and they have had some military actions up in the Himalayas. They have also had military action with India, and Pakistan also have disputed territory in the Himalayas. Some of the highest altitude fighting on the planet has occurred in these areas. Some of the Pakistan-India fighting occurs in areas where it's almost unbelievable that anybody could be up there for any amount of time, let alone be up there and conduct military operations at those altitudes. You're talking, fighting going on at 14,000, 15,000 feet, where it's just brutally cold, whipping winds, just basically an impossible area to survive, and yet here they are, and they're up there, and they're actually doing military operations. It's stunning what's been going on up there for quite some time. India, as I mentioned, has a very active border dispute with China. China has been moving airfields close to the border, and it's felt that China is getting ready to encroach more on Indian mountain territory in the Himalayas. And India and China, I should say China and Pakistan also have a strategic alliance. And Pakistan has been basically doing some of the Belt and Road stuff that India has been pushing out. And China has been playing off Pakistan against India for some time. So there's just a lot of moving parts in this thing, which really gets into a strategic balance of power in the South Asian area. And so that's what everybody's kind of looking at. And I was over in that region in 2002, and things got pretty heated back then. And you may recall that they were threatening each other with nuclear weapons back then. And the U.S. played a pretty important role in talking to both sides. You know, we had a good relationship with both countries, and we were able to explain to them the consequences of what could happen. And I happen to be the director of intelligence of the multinational consequence management joint task force that would have had to deal with that. So let's just say that they ramped down, they ratcheted down the temperature, they resolved the issues for that time, and we did not have a nuclear war in South Asia. Thank God. The consequences would have been horrible. But you still have a lot of very heightened tensions. You have a very unstable, some would say very fragile government in Pakistan. And the fear is that always the concern has been that neither side has the same level of protocols, checks and balances, safeguards with their nuclear weapons that you'll see in other countries like the US, Russia, China, that things could go sideways very quickly. And you see some of this with some of the Pakistani clerics, Islamic clerics, actually at the tail end of this thing that happened up in Kashmir, which is essentially a water dispute, if you will. They turn around and say, well, we need to be at the forefront of a global jihad against Israel, aligning Pakistan with the fighting in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And here you have that from influential leaders in a nuclear-armed country. By the way, Israel is also a nuclear-armed country. I think you start to get a sense of some of the uncertainty, some of the instability, some of the potential outcomes that can come from this situation if it's not properly managed. Unfortunately, this time the U.S. has stepped aside. We are not stepping in to work with both sides to ratchet it down. At least that's what we've said publicly. And we're leaving it to the two sides to work it out on their own. But traditionally, they've always needed someone else stepping in. Obviously, China's not going to step in because they're aligned against India. All right. Russia's not going to step in because, well, frankly, they're just Russia. And it's not clear who would step in outside the United States. Maybe Great Britain. You know, before they were the Pakistan, India, it was all part of the British Raj that controlled that larger India area. But I don't think either side would want to be talking to the Brits about this either. So not quite sure where this will go. But I do see that this could be a very serious problem. And the potential scenarios, you know, even if they started just doing what we call tactical nuclear employment on the battlefield, going after military targets, all it would take is somebody to decide to hit a military target close to a major urban area, and then, which would probably be Pakistan, and then India might respond by doing the same thing. Next thing you know, you got urban areas being targeted with nuclear weapons, and whereas these warheads are not the same yield, if you will, as some of the stuff that we have and Russia has and China has, they're still big nuclear warheads, and they will kick a phenomenal amount of smoke and dirt and debris into the upper atmosphere, into the stratosphere, and they could trigger what has been called a nuclear winter. That is not inconceivable. Wouldn't be as bad as if the U.S. and Russia were to do a full-on exchange of nuclear weapons, but it would be bad enough that it could cause crop failures around the world. You would have ionizing radiation that would be going in the upper atmosphere around the world. You'd have people having to decide to shelter in place. And by the way, even if it didn't cause an outright crop failure, it would probably, depending on which way the winds blow, you're going to irradiate a lot of prime farmland. And so the question is, you want to eat that stuff because now it's been contaminated. You could see where this could cause huge problems, potentially a global famine. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't want this to escalate. And I'll leave that at that. Now, let's talk about Russia and Ukraine. Many saw that in the Vatican, in the part of the larger facility that is St. Peter's Basilica, that President Trump, President Zelensky met. They were both going to be there. It was somewhat dubious if they were going to meet. but they actually met. They pulled some chairs up. They sat face to face by themselves, an amazing photo op, if nothing else, but they seemed to have a very constructive meeting. And they were both there for, obviously, Pope Francis's funeral, but it was something that has really kind of got everybody's attention. In fact, President Zelensky put out a post that says, if what came out of the meeting turns into actions, this could turn out to be quite historic. Unlike the stuff you've been hearing from the White House, where basically it sounded like the White House was in some ways repeating Putin talking points about, Crimea has to be part of Russia forever and a day, that Russia is going to keep its territories that it's gained. Many people asking the question, are there any concessions that we're asking Russia to make, or are we just beating up on Ukraine in order to force a deal that Ukraine can't live with? Well, long story short, that's not what we heard come out of this meeting. What we heard was that President Trump had talked about, certainly, referencing what's been happening with Russia attacking Ukraine, but also that Putin may not want peace and that maybe he's just, quote, tapping me along, unquote, or tapping me on maybe. Anyway, what he's saying is that Putin was basically playing him, that he was just playing for time, that he was saying things rhetorically that were not reflective in the actions by Russia. And then President Trump talked about maybe putting more banking sanctions on Russia and maybe secondary tariffs, that could be rather significant if he did that, which would put tariffs on countries like India and China for using Russian oil. That could cause a big hit with Russian oil revenue. And frankly, Russia is pretty much dependent on its oil and gas revenue to keep the country going, certainly to fund the war. So that could potentially be significant if he was able to do that. Russia's problems are big. Russia's economy is not as strong as most people think, certainly not as strong as a lot of the statistics make it look like. Those numbers usually go back to Russian numbers, and I don't trust Russian numbers. Most do not trust Russian numbers. I will say their economy hasn't collapsed, but in many cases, they're just squandering all of their resources in order to pay for this war. And in certain areas, for example, tanks, armored vehicles, they're literally just running out of tanks and armored vehicles. One of the reasons you see a lot of these horrible infantry assaults with massive loss of manpower is because they can't use tanks and armored vehicles because what they have are old and they're not survivable on the battlefield. And they just don't have enough of the new stuff that they can utilize it. And by the way, like so many other things Russian, some of the new stuff was big on claims of what they could do, rather short on actual combat capability when they got out there. So a lot of problems with Russian armor across the board. And frankly, I don't see them making massive battlefield gains with troops in the open marching side by side across the battlefield. That's just not going to happen. They can make some modest gains, but not massive gains with that. So Russia's got some big problems. 40% of the Russian gross domestic product, if you will, their economy is tied up with this war and with military. And at this point, it's not clear that Putin can even stop the war. Really, he can afford to stop the war. First, he's basically transitioned the economy to a war economy. So if he stops it, you're going to have a whole bunch of stuff stop in terms of production. You're going to have a lot of people who are working defense stuff suddenly not working defense stuff. In many cases, you could have mass unemployment. You could have enormous amounts of soldiers that all of a sudden are off the battlefield, back home, unemployed, unemployable in many cases. And that is a real brew for social discontent. What do you do with these, especially with the former soldiers, these well-trained combatants that are now home, frustrated, angry, unemployed, angry at the government for what happened and what it's done to them. There's just a lot of things that could happen there. So one of the things that's going on in the background, too, is that Steve Witkoff, who's a real estate negotiator that Trump knew from New York or knows from New York, good friend of Donald Trump's, has kind of become the envoy of everything, as they say. He's the envoy for the Russo-Ukraine war. He's our envoy to Iran. He's our envoy for the Gaza ceasefire discussions, all these different things. And those who know him say he's a very smart guy. but he's not an international, he's not, certainly not anybody who understands warfare, not someone who really has any depth on the international dynamics of what's going on there, nothing dealing with international political science issues, any of the normal things that you would expect somebody like that to have some sort of background in to deal with this. And in one interview with Tucker Carlson, he couldn't even recall the names of the 5 provinces or 5 oblasts, not even the 4 oblasts are currently battlefield areas in Ukraine. And that to me was very disturbing. So as much as Trump trusts him on certain levels, we're bumping up against this area where he just simply doesn't know what he doesn't know. And there are many who are saying, not only doesn't he know, but he doesn't know what he doesn't know. In other words, he doesn't seem to be aware that he doesn't really have the depth and background. And, you can go in there and not know everything if you surround your folks with folks who are really smart, and certainly use your skills to the best of your ability. But if you go in there with an idea that you don't need to know any of that stuff, that you have some sort of, intrinsic quality that will allow you to prevail, well, that's a pretty dangerous thing. And if you want to look at history on that, I would just point to the U.S. adventures in Iraq. We had some folks come in that just thought they knew better than the folks who actually did know the situation, and we ended up losing a lot of credibility and a lot of blood and treasure, if you will, in Iraq that probably didn't need to be sacrificed. And some of that goes at the doorstep to guys like Don Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and some others. So anyway, Trump's claim about Crimea, I kind of referenced that, but President Zelensky cannot cede sovereign de jure control of Crimea to Russia. It's not in the constitution of Ukraine to do that. And I'm hoping, and certainly a number of European countries are hoping, the defense minister of Germany said it again this weekend, that the U.S. has got to drop off this Crimea thing, because Crimea was basically taken over by covert action by the Russians. So that's we should not reward aggression like that. Now let's talk about the Iran nuclear agreement. Interestingly, what came out of that is, you may recall that the U.S. First Trump administration pulled out of that around shortly after the 2016 election. He came in 2017. The next year, we pulled out of the JCPOA, which is a 5 powers agreement that limits what they can do. Reason why? Well, first off, ballistic missiles weren't covered under that treaty. Iran was supporting all of its proxies throughout the region, like Hezbollah, like Hamas, like the Houthis. Probably sounds familiar to everybody. And so very frustrated, and they were still allowed to enrich uranium. They're limited to 3.67%, but now they've been enriching a lot of uranium up to 60%, and it's estimated that within a couple weeks, they could enrich that 60% to 90%, which is weapons-grade capability, if they were so inclined to do so. So there's just a lot of problems with that. Well, the idea was, the first U.S. position was that they would have no enrichment capability, that for peaceful purposes, they would import their enriched uranium from overseas, and it would go in there, and they could use that, but they would not be able to enrich any uranium, which did not give them the capability to enrich any uranium. So there would be no way that they could rapidly ramp up, if you will, to enrich uranium up to 60 or 90% like they have done in the past. Well, Witkoff went in there, came out, and started talking about we were going to allow them to enrich uranium up to 3.67%, which got a lot of criticism because it sounded like that was the same terms of the Obama-era JCPOA agreement that the Trump administration pulled out of because they felt it was grossly inadequate. And there was a lot of criticism from all over, not the least of which from a number of hawkish conservatives that said, what are you doing? You're basically handing them the same thing that they had before, the same thing that we thought was bad, the same reason that we pulled out to begin with. And then the big 3 things, the ballistic missiles, the proxies and stuff, along with the uranium. The other 2 are still not addressed in whatever this is, and it's not clear if they will be addressed. So I don't know, but I do say this. Iran's government is very fragile. Their economy is in probably the worst shape it's been since their revolution in 9. Most of the people do not like the Khomeini, the theocratic, autocratic government that's in place. And frankly, their situation has changed a lot. This last year has been just a political disaster for them. Hamas after October 7th has been just decimated. It's not completely destroyed, but if you look at Gaza, it's pretty much destroyed. And Hamas does not have a bright future. Let's just put it that way. I think everything in the negotiations there is about how to, end the existence of Hamas. Hezbollah has been neutralized to the point that the Lebanese government's talking about disarming Hezbollah. So this vast arsenal, if you will, to the north is pretty much going to be disarmed. Their main ally, and of course the ally of Hamas and the ally of other proxies, Syria, well, Assad is out of office. He was overthrown by a group that was led by someone who used to be part of al-Qaeda. And so Iran has lost all influence in Syria. Up there, the Turks have moved in because they were kind of ostensibly backing this group that the al-Qaeda guy was leading. So it's a pretty dynamic situation in Syria, but not one that Iran can do anything with. And then the U.S. has really gone after the Houthis in a big way. I don't know when that will end. I'm not quite sure how that's going to go, but we're doing a lot of bombing up there. And of course, we've got B-2 bombers in Diego Garcia. We've got a couple of carrier task forces out there. So right now, can't keep that stuff there forever, but right now there's a lot of military capability that's sitting real close within striking distance of Iran that puts a lot of pressure on whatever these negotiations are going to look like. So we'll see which way that ends up going. But time is a factor, but probably that clock's being heard louder in Tehran than anywhere else because they realize the U.S. has a period of time where they have these things in place, like the B-2 bombers, but we can't keep them there forever. So we're probably going to feel compelled to either use them to support some sort of strikes on with these big penetrator, these MOP bombs that can do deep penetration into the ground to take out these bunkers and tunnels where Iran produces and does all sorts of stuff with its ballistic missiles and nuclear capability and everything else, or pull them back. So they realize there is some real pressure there, and we actually have the forces in place that can make something like that happen. In Gaza, the latest is that Egypt has put out a proposal for a 7-year ceasefire, full IDF withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, release of all hostages, release of the Palestinian prisoners, and Hamas declaring it has laid down its weapons. I don't think that Israel will ever trust Hamas to make any declaration or follow through on that, and I'm not sure that what Israel wants to do. The other thing out there is there's the Trump Riviera plan, as they call it, where the U.S. comes in and literally takes control of the Gaza Strip and finds some way to rebuild it using other people's money. Israel's goals right now is just to eliminate the threat of Hamas across the board and the threat of any other Palestinian groups that threaten Israel. And so that's what their main focus is on that. And certainly in the West Bank, they want to basically acquire what had been Palestinian lands, all right? So there's a lot of questions. Who pays for rebuilding? Who provides the security force in Gaza if the IDF pulls out? The question becomes these big buffer zones that Israel's put in place. How would those be dealt with? Would they go away? Would the IDF still control those buffer zones? And then you have this far-right faction, which is part of Netanyahu's coalition. What do they want? Well, some of them actually want Israel to take over the Gaza Strip in total. They want Israel to go ahead and just take over the West Bank. They want to kick out all the Palestinians that live there, and they want to be Israeli lands with Jewish Israeli settlers living in all these lands. That's the far, far, far right spectrum of what's tied to Netanyahu's coalition, but they do have a voice within his government. I'm not saying a prevailing voice, but they do have a voice. Obviously, that's nothing the international community will ever agree with, but it is something just to be aware of. All right. Now, the PLO has been talked about, the Palestinian Authority, as a governing entity. It has been so corrupt, so poorly run under Mahmoud Abbas, who is 89 years old, and he's been there forever, and there's been no election to replace him. He has finally, this last week, named a successor, who is someone very close to him, also someone who spent 10 years in Israeli prison. I don't know if Israel's going to be thrilled about having that person as a replacement. But he's trying to position the Palestinian Authority in such a way that they could actually step in and do something. I don't know. I'm a little leery of how that's going to work. But it is interesting. I'm just not holding my breath that there's going to be a solution that happens in Gaza real soon. But there is a phenomenal amount of pressure to get another ceasefire into place and to get all the remaining Israeli hostages free. I think that has a possibility. I don't think it's going to be 7 years, but I think that has a greater possibility of success. Hey, thanks for listening to STRAT. I've covered a lot of stuff. Obviously, if you want to listen to all the STRAT podcasts, go to stratpodcast.com. Also, you can go to Hal Kempfer TV on YouTube to see all my news segments. And you can also go to the GRIP SA, that's GRIPSA.com website for global risk intelligence and planning. I appear on a variety of networks, but News Nation, Live Now from Fox on a pretty regular basis. So anyway, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching if you're watching on YouTube, and looking forward to talking to you next time.